Barometric pressure's dropping, muttered the base librarian, shelving books nearby. Humidity's at 73%, temperature's 68 degrees Fahrenheit. In conditions like this, that bullet's going to drop 4 inches more than your scope's telling you. 6 instructors turned to stare at the old man who'd just calculated ballistics in his head. Welcome to Hidden Heroes. Before we begin this incredible story of hidden expertise and quiet mastery, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from today. And if you believe the most extraordinary people are often hiding in plain sight, hit that subscribe button and help us honor the legends walking among us. The morning fog clung to Camp Pendleton like a shroud, muffling the sound of rifle fire from the advanced sniper training range. In the base library, 68-year-old Harold Chen methodically arranged returned books on their proper shelves, his weathered fingers moving with the precision of someone who had spent decades organizing his world into perfect systems. For 12 years, Harold had been the head librarian at the Marine Corps base in Southern California. To the young Marines who occasionally wandered in seeking technical manuals or internet access, he was just another civilian contractor, a quiet old man with thick glasses and cardigans who kept their books in order and never raised his voice above a whisper. What they didn't know was that Harold Chen had once held a very different kind of precision instrument in his hands. The crack of gunfire from the nearby sniper range was a constant background symphony during Harold's workday. Today, however, the rhythm seemed off. Instead of the measured, confident reports of successful shots, he heard the frustrated volleys of repeated misses. Through the library's tall windows, he could see the distant figures of instructors and students clustered around the 1,200-yard line, their body language speaking of mounting frustration. Master Gunnery Sergeant Maria Santos paced behind her 6 advanced sniper candidates, her voice carrying across the range despite the distance. "Gentlemen, this is embarrassing. You're supposed to be the cream of the crop, headed for Force Recon in MARSOC. A 200-yard shot should be routine at your level." Corporal James Mitchell, one of the most promising students, chambered another round in his M40A5 sniper rifle. He'd been shooting professionally for 3 years and had never struggled this much with environmental conditions. Through his scope, the target seemed to dance in the heat mirage, and every shot was coming up short and left. "Wind's not that strong," Mitchell muttered to his shooting partner, Lance Corporal Rodriguez. "Maybe 8 knots from the southwest should be an easy compensation." Staff Sergeant Williams, the senior instructor, lowered his spotting scope with obvious frustration. "That's shot number 47, and we haven't had a single center mass hit. Someone want to explain to me how 6 of our best shooters suddenly can't hit the broadside of a barn?" The morning had started with promise. Weather conditions appeared ideal. Clear skies, moderate temperatures, and what seemed like manageable wind. But every shot was falling short, and the lateral displacement was inconsistent, making it impossible to establish a reliable correction pattern. Inside the library, Harold paused in his work. He'd been listening to the frustrated voices carrying on the morning breeze, and something about their problem nagged at him. He moved to the window that faced the range and studied the conditions with eyes that had once calculated such things as a matter of life and death. The flag at the 600-yard marker was barely moving, but Harold noticed something the shooters hadn't. The marine layer was creating a temperature inversion, and the barometric pressure had been dropping steadily since dawn. More importantly, there were subtle thermal currents rising from the concrete pads near the targets, heat mirages that would affect bullet trajectory in ways that weren't immediately obvious to shooters focused only on wind flags. "Temperature differential between ground level and target elevation is probably 6 degrees, Harold murmured to himself, his mind automatically running calculations he hadn't used in 40 years. Air density variance, combined with falling pressure, they're shooting in a completely different atmosphere than their ballistics tables account for. The frustration on the range was becoming audible. Master Gunnery Sergeant Santos was now personally coaching each shot, but even her expertise couldn't overcome the environmental factors none of them had properly identified. Harold found himself walking toward the window, drawn by the familiar puzzle of external ballistics. It had been decades since he'd needed to calculate for Coriolis effect, air density, and temperature gradients, but the mental processes came flooding back as if they'd been waiting just beneath the surface of his librarian's routine. "Humidity's rising too," he noted, watching the way light refracted differently at various points along the range. "Maybe started at 60% this morning, now pushing 75. That's going to affect bullet stability, especially with match-grade ammunition. 20 minutes passed before Harold made a decision that would change everything. He locked the library's front desk, hung up his "back in 15 minutes" sign, and walked the quarter-mile to the sniper range. His sensible walking shoes crunched softly on the gravel path, and his civilian contractor badge bounced gently against his cardigan. The range was in full crisis mode when Harold arrived. Master Gunnery Sergeant Santos was on her radio, apparently calling for a range safety officer to inspect the rifles and ammunition. Staff Sergeant Williams was checking 0 on every scope, convinced there had to be a mechanical failure. The 6 sniper candidates sat in frustrated silence, their confidence shaken by an impossible morning of missed shots. Harold approached slowly, not wanting to interrupt what was clearly a serious training evolution. He positioned himself near a supply shed about 50 yards behind the firing line, close enough to observe but far enough away to remain unnoticed. From this position, he could see both the shooters and the environmental conditions they were struggling with. Corporal Mitchell was back behind his rifle, trying yet another shot. Harold watched the young Marine's technique. His breathing was correct, his trigger pull smooth, his position stable. There was nothing wrong with the fundamentals. But as Mitchell prepared to fire, Harold noticed the shooter wasn't accounting for the thermal distortion he could clearly see rising from the concrete target stands. The shot cracked across the range, and the spotter's call confirmed another miss. Low and left, 18 inches. That's when Harold spoke, his voice barely above conversational volume but carrying clearly in the morning air. Barometric pressures dropping, humidities at 73%, temperatures 68 degrees Fahrenheit. In conditions like this, that bullet's going to drop 4 inches more than your scope's telling you. 6 instructors and 6 students turned as one to stare at the elderly librarian who had just calculated ballistics data in his head while they struggled with rangefinders and weather stations. Master Gunnery Sergeant Santos recovered first. "I'm sorry, who are you?" Harold suddenly felt the weight of 14 pairs of eyes on him. For 12 years, he had successfully maintained his invisibility, content to live quietly among warriors without being recognized as one himself. Now, with a few words about atmospheric conditions, he had shattered that carefully constructed anonymity. "Harold Chen," he said simply. "I work at the base library. I used to do some shooting and I noticed you were having trouble with the environmental conditions." Staff Sergeant Williams stepped forward, his expression skeptical but curious. "Mr. Chen, what kind of shooting experience are you talking about?" Harold hesitated. This was the moment he had successfully avoided for more than a decade. The moment when his past would collide with his carefully constructed present, when Harold the librarian would have to acknowledge the existence of someone he had been long ago. "Military shooting," Harold said quietly. "Long time ago. Different war." The range fell silent, except for the distant sound of wind through the observation tower. Master Gunnery Sergeant Santos studied Harold's face, noting details she hadn't seen before, the way he held himself despite his civilian clothes, the precision of his speech, the calm assessment in his eyes as he evaluated not just the environment but the people around him. "What branch?" she asked. "Marines," Harold replied. "Force Recon, Vietnam, 1969 to 1972. The admission seemed to change the very air around them. Vietnam-era Force Recon Marines were a rare breed, and the ones who had survived were rarer still. These were the men who had operated behind enemy lines, often alone, for weeks at a time. They were precision shooters, intelligence gatherers, and survivors of a war that had tested human limits in ways few conflicts ever had. Corporal Mitchell, still behind his rifle, found his voice first. "Sir, with respect, what makes you think our calculations are wrong?" Harold looked at the young Marine with eyes that held no condescension, only understanding. "Because I can see the thermal distortion you can't. The air temperature at ground level is different from the temperature at target elevation. Your ballistic computer is calculating for standard atmospheric conditions, but you're not shooting in standard conditions." He pointed toward the target area. "See how the light shimmers differently about 2/3 of the way down range? That's a temperature gradient. Your bullet is traveling through 3 different air densities between here and the target. Plus, the barometric pressure has dropped 4 millibars since sunrise. That affects air resistance and bullet drop." Staff Sergeant Williams looked at his weather station, then back at Harold. How do you know the pressure dropped 4 millibars? Harold pointed to a cloud formation on the horizon. Those cumulus clouds weren't there an hour ago. Formation pattern indicates a pressure system moving in from the west. Also, the wind direction shifted about 15 minutes ago. You can see it in how the grass is bending near the 800-yard marker. It's subtle, but it's consistent with a pressure change. The Marines exchanged glances. This wasn't the casual observation of a weekend hunter. This was the environmental awareness of someone who had once depended on such details for survival. Master Gunnery Sergeant Santos made a decision. "Mr. Chen, would you mind sharing what adjustments you think we should make?" Harold walked closer to the firing line, his eyes continuously scanning the range environment. Temperature differential is probably 6 degrees between here and target. Humidity increase of about 12% since you started shooting. Falling pressure. You'll want to add about 2.3 MOA elevation to compensate for the density-altitude change, and hold about 1.1 MOA left to account for the humidity effect on bullet stability. The specificity of his recommendations was staggering. While the Marines had been making rough adjustments based on general environmental factors, Harold was calculating for micro-conditions they hadn't even considered. Corporal Mitchell made the adjustments Harold suggested. The mathematics felt strange. He was compensating for environmental factors his training had barely touched on. But something in the old librarian's quiet confidence made him trust the calculations. He settled behind his rifle, controlled his breathing, and squeezed the trigger. The spotter's call came immediately. "Center mass hit. Dead center." The range erupted in surprised voices, but Harold simply nodded as if the result had been inevitable. "The thermal gradient is still there," he said calmly. "Next shot should hold the same corrections unless the wind changes." Mitchell fired again. Another center mass hit. Rodriguez quickly adjusted his own scope settings and fired. Perfect hit. One by one, all 6 Marines began hitting their targets with precision they hadn't achieved all morning. The frustrated morning of missed shots transformed into a clinic of successful long-range shooting, all because a librarian had noticed environmental factors they had overlooked. Master Gunnery Sergeant Santos approached Harold with newfound respect. "Mr. Chen, that was remarkable shooting advice. How long were you in Force Recon?" 3 tours, Harold replied quietly. 78 missions total, mostly intelligence gathering and target reconnaissance, but sometimes—" He paused, the memories of a different life washing over him. Sometimes the mission required precision shooting. Staff Sergeant Williams had been studying Harold's face, and suddenly recognition dawned. "Chen, Harold Chen, Jesus Christ, you're Ghost Dragon." The name hit the range like a physical shock. Every Marine sniper knew the legend of Ghost Dragon, the Force Recon sniper who had held the long-range precision record for over 30 years. The man who had made shots in Vietnam that were still considered impossible by today's standards. The Phantom who had operated alone in the jungle for weeks at a time, calling in airstrikes and eliminating high-value targets with supernatural accuracy. Harold's shoulders sagged slightly, the weight of recognition settling on him like a familiar burden. "That was a long time ago," he said quietly. 143 confirmed kills, Staff Sergeant Williams said, his voice filled with awe. "Longest confirmed kill shot, 2,100 yards with an M40 rifle in 1971. You're a legend, sir." The young Marines stared in stunned silence. They had been receiving shooting advice from one of the greatest snipers in military history, a man whose techniques were still taught in advanced marksmanship schools. And he had been shelving books in their base library for 12 years without anyone knowing who he was. Corporal Mitchell found his voice first. "Sir, why didn't you, why work in the library? Why not teach marksmanship?" Harold looked out at the range, where targets stood ready for the next evolution. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades. "Because teaching shooting means teaching killing. And I've done enough of both for one lifetime." He turned to face the young Marines, his expression gentle but serious. "You men are learning to be precision marksmen in service of your country. That's honorable work and necessary work, but it changes you. Every shot you take in combat, every life you're responsible for ending, it becomes part of who you are forever." Harold paused, organizing his thoughts with the same precision he brought to his library work. "When I came home from Vietnam, I needed to find peace. I found it in books, in quiet work, in helping people learn instead of helping them die. The library became my sanctuary. Master Gunnery Sergeant Santos nodded slowly, understanding beginning to dawn on her face. But you came out here today. Why break your own rule about teaching shooting? Harold smiled sadly. Because watching good Marines struggle with problems I could solve, that's not peace either. Sometimes we have to choose between our own comfort and our responsibility to others. The morning training evolution continued, but everything had changed. Under Harold's quiet guidance, the 6 Marines not only improved their environmental reading skills, but began to understand the deeper responsibilities that came with their chosen profession. Harold didn't just teach them about air pressure and temperature gradients. He helped them understand the weight of precision, the responsibility that came with the ability to reach out and touch someone at impossible distances. As the training session concluded, Staff Sergeant Williams approached Harold privately. "Sir, I have to ask, would you consider doing this more formally? Our advanced students could learn more from you in a week than they get in months of conventional training." Harold was quiet for a long moment, watching the young Marines clean their rifles and secure their equipment. "I'll think about it," he said finally. "But if I do this, it won't be about making better killers. It'll be about making better Marines. There's a difference." Over the following months, Harold Chen became the most sought-after instructor at Camp Pendleton, though he never wore a uniform or held an official position. He taught environmental reading, advanced ballistics, and fieldcraft to selected students. But more importantly, he taught them the psychological and ethical dimensions of precision shooting, helping them understand that the ability to take life at long range came with profound responsibilities. The Marines called him simply Mr. Chen, though they all knew they were learning from a legend. He continued working in the library, maintaining his quiet routine among the books. But twice a week, he would walk to the range and share knowledge that couldn't be found in any manual. Harold never spoke about his specific missions in Vietnam, never told war stories or relived past glories. Instead, he focused on the technical and philosophical aspects of precision shooting, helping young Marines understand that their rifles were tools, not just of war, but of responsibility. His students learned more than marksmanship. They learned patience, environmental awareness, and the mental discipline required to make life-and-death decisions at impossible distances. Most importantly, they learned respect for their weapons, for their targets, and for the awesome responsibility that came with the ability to reach across vast distances and change lives forever. Years later, many of those students would go on to serve with distinction in Iraq and Afghanistan. When they made crucial shots that saved American lives or prevented terrorist attacks, they carried with them not just Harold's technical training, but his moral framework. They understood that precision shooting wasn't about showing off or accumulating statistics. It was about service, sacrifice, and the careful application of deadly force in defense of others. Harold Chen had found a way to serve again without compromising his hard-won peace. In the quiet morning hours at the library, surrounded by books and the gentle routines of civilian life, he had discovered that teaching wisdom was more important than teaching technique, and that true legends were made not in the moment of the shot, but in the decades of service that followed. Sometimes the most extraordinary people are shelving books right next to you. They're the quiet ones who never mention their past, never seek recognition, never claim the respect they've earned 100 times over. Harold Chen spent 40 years perfecting the art of precision, then 12 more years perfecting the art of peace. And when young warriors needed guidance, he proved that the greatest victory isn't hitting the target, it's knowing when not to shoot at all. Have you ever discovered that someone ordinary was actually extraordinary? Tell us about it in the comments. And if this story reminds you to look twice at the quiet people around you, subscribe to Hidden Heroes. Because sometimes the person organizing your books once saved the world, one impossible shot at a time. This story is a work of fiction created to honor the spirit of service and the quiet veterans who walk among us. Any resemblance to actual persons or events is purely coincidental.